The sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The crowd at Belmont Park roared with excitement as the final race of the evening concluded. The scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass filled the air as the victorious horse and jockey paraded past the grandstands, basking in the glory of their win. But in one of the quieter corners of the stable, away from the flashing cameras and roaring fans, a single thoroughbred stood still. His muscles were tense, his ears pricked forward, and his dark eyes flickered with something few had ever noticed before, an unshakable longing. This was Phantom's Fury, a champion racehorse known for his unbreakable spirit and lightning speed. He had spent years training, competing, and winning, but the victories no longer held meaning. The roaring crowds, the golden trophies, the flashing cameras, none of it satisfied the deep yearning inside him. The fences that surrounded him no longer felt like protection, they felt like prison walls. His stable was luxurious, filled with polished saddles, freshly laid hay, and gleaming trophies. But Phantom longed for something else. The wind in his manner, the freedom to run without limits, the ability to choose his own destiny. Tonight, his mind was not on racing. Tonight, he had one goal: to escape. From the moment Phantom's Fury took his first shaky steps, the trainers at Willowbrook Stables knew he was special. His bloodline traced back to some of the greatest racehorses in history. His legs were long and lean, his muscles developed early, and his stride was smoother than any colt his age. His owner, an ambitious businessman named Richard Hale, had placed all his bets on this one horse, believing he was destined to dominate the track. Richard was known for his ruthless tactics in the business world, and he carried the same mentality into horse racing: win at all costs. Phantom's Fury lived up to the hype. His first gallops were mesmerizing, his acceleration unmatched. His trainers pushed him hard, recognizing that they had something rare, a horse with the potential to be a legend. Yet, despite his unmatched talent, there was something different about Phantom. He never seemed to revel in the thrill of competition the way other horses did. There was a restlessness in his eyes, an untamed fire that spoke of something more. Even as a young colt, he had shown signs that he was different. While other horses eagerly followed their training routines, Phantom often strayed to the farthest corners of the pasture, gazing beyond the fences, ears twitching at the sound of distant winds rustling through the trees. It was as if he could sense a world beyond the track, one he was meant to explore. Richard, however, saw none of this. To him, Phantom was nothing more than a means to an end. He invested heavily in Phantom's training, hiring the best jockeys and pushing him beyond his limits. He was a perfectionist, and he expected nothing less than absolute dominance. But one person noticed what others did not: Emily Carter. A stable hand at Willowbrook, Emily had been assigned to care for Phantom since his birth. She had watched him grow from a fragile foal into a powerful stallion. Unlike the trainers who saw only his speed and stamina, Emily saw the horse beneath the muscle and medals. She saw his longing, his intelligence, and his desire for something beyond the racetrack. Phantom and Emily formed an unspoken bond. She was the only one who spoke to him softly, who took time to brush his coat with gentle strokes, who let him linger in the fields just a little longer than the others. While the world saw him as a champion, she saw him as a soul trapped in a life he never chose. As Phantom grew older, Richard's obsession with making him a champion intensified. Every day became a grueling test of endurance. Emily began noticing the subtle changes, his once lively spirit dimming, his movements becoming more mechanical. He was winning every race, but at what cost? There were moments when Phantom would refuse to train, moments when he'd stop at the edge of the track and simply stare at the open fields beyond. Emily could feel it: he wasn't meant to be here. She often wondered if Phantom felt the same thing she did, that there was something more waiting for him beyond the fences. Late at night, when the other horses were resting, Emily would sneak into Phantom's stall and let him roam a little longer. She saw the way his ears perked up when he felt the open air, how his muscles relaxed when he wasn't bound by reins and commands. Then came the races. Phantom shattered records, making Richard more ambitious, more demanding. Emily, however, started seeing something else in Phantom: a quiet resistance. His wins no longer felt like triumphs, they felt like a cage closing tighter around him. Little did she know, Phantom's heart was already searching for a way out. The day had finally arrived. The sun shone brightly over Churchill Downs, casting a golden glow over the perfectly manicured racetrack. The energy in the air was electric. Spectators filled the stands, trainers barked last-minute instructions, and the sharp scent of damp earth and sweat filled Phantom's nostrils. For months, he had been preparing for this moment. Every early morning gallop, every exhausting drill, every ounce of sweat poured into his training had led to this, his first professional race. Emily stood by his side, adjusting his bridle, whispering words of encouragement. "You've got this, Phantom. Just run like you always do. she murmured, stroking his sleek, dark coat. Phantom flicked his ears, his muscles twitching in anticipation. The starting gates loomed ahead, metallic and intimidating, but he did not fear them, he feared failure more. The walk from the paddock to the starting gates felt like a slow-motion sequence in a movie. Every eye in the crowd seemed to be on him. Some admired his physique, some doubted his ability, and some whispered that he was too young, too untested. Richard Hale, his owner, stood near the track with a confident smirk. "Don't mess this up, Phantom," he muttered under his breath. Emily shot him a glare, but Phantom wasn't listening. His heart pounded with the thrill of the unknown. The other horses lined up beside him, veterans, seasoned racers who had already seen their fair share of victories and defeats. Beside him stood Ironclad, a muscular chestnut stallion with a reputation for aggressive racing. To his left was Stormbreaker, a grey colt known for explosive speed in the final stretch. Phantom lowered his head, nostrils flaring, taking in their scents, feeling their presence. This was not just a test of speed, it was a battle of wills. The gates clanked open one by one. The handlers led the horses in. Phantom hesitated. For a brief moment, something inside him told him this wasn't where he belonged. The roaring crowd, the flashing cameras, the expectation, it all felt overwhelming. Emily sensed his hesitation. She touched his neck gently. "Just focus. You were born for this." That was all it took. Phantom took a deep breath and stepped into the metal enclosure. The gates locked behind him. No turning back now. The moment stretched into eternity. The world outside the gate fell silent. Phantom could hear nothing but the rhythmic sound of his own breathing, the steady pounding of his heart. Then, bang! The gates flew open and the horses exploded forward like arrows from a bow. The ground trembled beneath their hooves, clumps of dirt flying in all directions as they surged forward. Phantom sprang into action, his powerful legs propelling him forward with an energy he had never felt before. The wind howled in his ears, his manet whipped wildly, and his vision tunneled toward the track ahead. He was running, truly running, not just in training, not just for practice. For the first few seconds, he was lost in the chaos, bodies pressed around him, hooves clashing, the scent of sweat thick in the air. Ironclad threw his shoulder into Phantom, trying to intimidate him early. Phantom staggered but didn't back down. He pushed forward, fighting for space. Emily had taught him patience, not to waste his energy in the first half of the race. He settled into third place, watching Stormbreaker and Ironclad battle for the lead. The crowd was a blur. The track was endless. Halfway through, Phantom felt the burn in his legs, but he knew this was the moment to decide, stay safe or risk it all. He chose the latter. He dug his hooves into the track and surged forward, inching up beside Stormbreaker. The grey colt noticed his presence and picked up speed, trying to shake him off. But Phantom was not backing down. The final turn approached. The horses ahead pushed harder, the finish line now in sight. Emily's words echoed in his mind. "Find your opening. Take it." And then, there it was. A small gap between Stormbreaker and Ironclad. A space barely wide enough for Phantom to squeeze through. Most horses would hesitate. Phantom didn't. With a sudden burst of speed, he charged through the gap, his body nearly brushing against both competitors. The crowd gasped. Even the announcer's voice cracked with excitement. Now only one horse stood between him and victory, Ironclad. The chestnut stallion had been leading since the start, conserving energy for a final sprint. Phantom matched his stride, their hooves pounding the earth in perfect synchronization. The crowd was on their feet. 50 meters. 40. 30. Ironclad tried to pull away, but Phantom was relentless. 20 meters. 10. And then, Phantom found another gear. He pushed past his limits, stretching forward in a desperate final lunge. The photo finish camera clicked. Silence fell over the stadium. Phantom threw his head up, panting, his heart pounding against his ribcage. For a moment, no one knew who had won. The scoreboard flickered. And then, Phantom's name appeared at the top. The crowd erupted. Emily screamed with joy, running toward the track. Richard Hale grinned, but there was something else in his eyes. Something calculating. Phantom had won his first race. He had proven himself. But as he stood there, his body drenched in sweat, heart racing, he felt nothing. The thrill was supposed to come now. The joy, the pride. But all he felt was emptiness. Why? The cheers faded into the background. The flashing cameras blurred. Somewhere deep inside, he realized, this wasn't his dream. It never had been. Phantom's victories continued. With every race, he climbed higher in the ranks, becoming a household name in the world of horse racing. Richard Hale basked in the success, his investment turning into a goldmine. The media hailed Phantom as the next great champion, sponsors lined up, and fans adored him. But behind the scenes, the pressure mounted. His training intensified. His schedule was brutal. There was no time for rest, no time for the open fields he once knew as a foal. The track became his life, a confined world of competition and expectations. Every morning, before the sun had even risen, Phantom was led from his stall to begin his workouts. Lap after lap, drill after drill, he pushed his body to the limits, but the joy of running had faded. He was no longer racing because he loved it, he was racing because he had no other choice. Trainers became stricter, their commands sharper. They no longer spoke to him with admiration but with expectation. He was not just a horse, he was an investment that needed to deliver results. Any sign of fatigue was dismissed as laziness, any hesitation was met with harsher training sessions. Emily noticed the change in him. She saw the way his ears no longer perked up when she approached, the way his once proud stance had slumped, the way his eyes had lost their fire. He was still winning, still performing, but he was losing himself in the process. Then came the Derby Cup, the race that should have cemented his legacy. The moment Phantom stepped onto the track, he could feel something was different. The energy in the air was not just excitement, it was tension, desperation, a hunger for dominance. This was not just a race, this was a war. As soon as the gates burst open, the aggression began. The other horses pushed and bumped against him, their jockeys yelling commands, urging them forward with ruthless intensity. Phantom felt hooves striking dangerously close, the sting of sweat and dust clouding his vision. This was not the thrill of racing, this was survival. Then, disaster struck. A rival horse, Midnight Fury, clipped Phantom's back leg in a vicious attempt to block him. Phantom's hooves slipped, his body tilting dangerously forward. Gasps rippled through the crowd as his front legs dug into the dirt, his momentum nearly sending him crashing down. For a split second, time froze. Phantom fought to regain balance, his powerful muscles straining, his breath ragged. The world around him blurred, the crowd, the announcer's frantic voice, the pounding hooves of his competitors surging ahead. Then, with a desperate push, he recovered. But the moment of hesitation had cost him. By the time he found his rhythm again, the finish line was already approaching. He surged forward, muscles screaming, lungs burning, but it was too late. He finished second. The crowd cheered, but Richard Hale's expression was stone cold. Second place was not acceptable. That night, there was no celebration. No pats on the neck, no treats, no soft words of encouragement. Phantom was led back to his stall in silence. He could feel the weight of disappointment hanging in the air. Richard Hale was furious. "You let him go soft," he spat at the trainers. "No more breaks. No more distractions. He trains harder, or we find another champion." The next morning, Phantom's new regimen began. Tighter restrictions. More drills. No freedom. His stall, once open to fresh air, was now kept closed, limiting his distractions. His workouts doubled, his diet adjusted for peak performance, his days meticulously controlled to ensure maximum speed and endurance. The walls were closing in. Phantom no longer recognized himself. He obeyed commands, but without passion. He ran, but without joy. He ate, but without hunger. Even Emily's presence could not lift his spirits. She still visited him, still spoke to him in hushed tones, but he no longer nuzzled into her touch. Something inside him was breaking. And then, one evening, as he stood alone in his stall, he looked out at the dark horizon beyond the racetrack. A thought took root. He had been born for speed. Not to win trophies. Not to satisfy owners. Not to be locked in a system that cared only about results. He had been born to run free. That night, for the first time, Phantom did not dream of victory. He dreamed of escape. The weeks after the Derby Cup loss were unbearable. Phantom's training regimen became even more relentless. The trainers pushed him harder, increasing his workouts, reducing his rest, and tightening the rules around his daily schedule. Every moment of his day was accounted for. Wake up, train, eat, train, sleep. There was no freedom, no joy, only repetition. Phantom started resisting. He refused to respond to the bit, fought against commands, and even hesitated at the starting gates. It was not rebellion, it was exhaustion. He was physically present but mentally slipping away. Emily noticed the change immediately. She saw the once vibrant stallion growing duller with each passing day. He no longer neighed excitedly when she arrived, nor did he nuzzle into her hand as he once did. His spirit was fading, his fire dimming, his will eroding under the crushing weight of expectation. One evening, as Emily brushed Phantom's coat in the quiet of the stable, she whispered, "You don't want to be here, do you?" Phantom let out a deep sigh, his ears flicking back. He understood her words. That was the moment she made up her mind. If no one else would save him, she would. She would set him free. But escaping from one of the most secure racing facilities in the country would not be easy. She spent the next few days observing the routines of the night guards, memorizing the placement of cameras, and looking for weak spots in the fencing. She knew she would have to time it perfectly. One wrong move could get Phantom injured, or worse, caught. Emily also had to make sure Phantom was ready. If he got injured in the escape, it would all be for nothing. Secretly, she began taking him on late-night walks, stretching his legs, keeping his muscles strong but away from the trainer's harsh drills. She found hidden patches of grass beyond the training grounds, letting Phantom experience what it felt like to run for the sake of running rather than for winning. She exposed him to the sounds of the wild, crickets, rustling leaves, distant howls, knowing he would soon have to survive without the comforts of the stable. But Richard Hale and his trainers began to notice Phantom's subtle change in behavior. He was still resistant in training, but there was something different in his eyes, a glimmer of hope, an unspoken secret. One evening, a trainer muttered, "That horse is up to something." Emily's heart pounded. They were starting to suspect. As the days passed, security around Phantom tightened. The cameras were adjusted. Guards made extra rounds. The window of opportunity for escape was closing. Then, one night, Emily overheard something that made her blood run cold. Richard Hale was considering selling Phantom to a breeding farm. If that happened, his fate would be sealed. He would spend the rest of his life in forced retirement, never knowing the taste of freedom. Emily knew she had to act now. The perfect moment arrived on a stormy night. The heavy rain and crashing thunder would mask the sounds of movement. The guards, seeking shelter, would be distracted. This was it. She crept into the stable, her hands shaking. Phantom was already awake, as if he knew what was coming. Their eyes met, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. "Let's get you out of here," she whispered. She unlatched his stall, carefully leading him out into the dark. Every step was calculated, every breath held. Thunder rumbled overhead. The rain poured. The world around them blurred. Emily had spent weeks preparing. Now, there was only one thing left to do: run. The storm raged overhead, thunder rolling like the drums of war. Rain pounded against the stable roof, a relentless downpour that drowned out all but the howling wind. It was the perfect night for an escape. Emily crouched beside Phantom's stall, her pulse hammering. The stable was eerily quiet, the usual rustling of horses muffled by the storm. Most of the security guards had taken shelter inside, leaving only one or two patrolling near the fences. This was her only chance. Phantom stood still, his dark eyes locked onto Emily's. He knew. He had always known. She pressed her forehead against his, whispering, "It's time. We have to go." She unlatched the stall door, the hinges creaking despite her careful touch. Phantom moved gracefully beside her, his step soundless on the wet straw-covered ground. They navigated through the stable's shadowed corridors, every second stretching into an eternity. Then, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. A guard. He was standing at the far end of the barn, his back turned. Emily's breath caught in her throat. If he turned around, if he saw them. Phantom shifted beside her, sensing the danger. Emily placed a calming hand on his flank, willing him to stay still. The guard checked his radio, muttered something, and then, to Emily's immense relief, walked away toward the main office. They moved again. Faster now. Phantom's muscles tensed beneath his sleek coat, coiled like a spring ready to launch. They slipped through the last set of doors, stepping into the stormy night. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the perimeter fence in the distance, the final barrier between Phantom and his freedom. But as they reached the edge of the training grounds, a sharp voice rang out. "Hey! Stop right there!" A floodlight blazed to life, casting harsh shadows across the wet ground. They had been seen. Emily didn't think. She slapped Phantom's flank, hard. "Go! Run!" Phantom hesitated for the briefest of moments, his instincts warring between staying with Emily and obeying the command. Then, he turned and bolted. The world blurred around him as he galloped like never before. His hooves pounded against the rain-soaked earth, mud splattering up his legs as he surged toward the fence. Behind him, shouts erupted. The security guards gave chase, their radios crackling with frantic orders. A truck engine roared to life. Phantom's breath came in sharp bursts. The fence was getting closer, but so were his pursuers. A gunshot rang out, not aimed at him, but into the air, a warning. Phantom didn't stop. 30 feet. 20. 10. Phantom gathered himself, every muscle tightening, every fiber of his being focused on one thing, clearing the fence. Emily watched from a distance, her hands clenched into fists, praying he would make it. And then, he leapt. For a moment, time seemed to stop. His body arched gracefully over the fence, clearing it by mere inches. His back hooves barely skimmed the top rail before he landed on the other side, stumbling but quickly regaining his stride. He was free. The guards skidded to a stop, cursing, knowing they had no chance of catching him now. No horse could match his speed. Emily sagged against the stable wall, tears mixing with the rain on her face. She had done it. He was safe. Phantom didn't stop running. He didn't look back. He ran until the bright lights of the racetrack faded, until the only sounds were the distant rumble of thunder and his own pounding heartbeat. The land stretched out before him, vast, open, limitless. For the first time in his life, there were no barriers. He slowed, his breath ragged, his legs aching, but he felt alive in a way he never had before. He lifted his head to the sky, feeling the wind in his maner, tasting the rain on his tongue. This was what he had been meant for. And somewhere, far behind, Emily watched him disappear, a bittersweet smile on her lips. The world would never see Phantom's Fury race again. But for the first time, he was truly winning. The morning after Phantom's escape, the racing world was in chaos. News channels flashed urgent headlines: champion racehorse vanishes, stolen or runaway. Reporters swarmed Belmont Park, cameras rolling as security teams scoured the area. Richard Hale, furious and red-faced, offered an enormous reward for Phantom's return. 4 days, helicopters hovered over fields, search teams spread across the countryside, and posters of Phantom's Fury appeared on every ranch and equestrian facility within 100 miles. But Phantom was nowhere to be found. He had vanished into the wild. At first, Phantom ran endlessly, his hooves pounding against the earth. He had never known such freedom. The wind rushed through his maner, the moonlight guiding him through the unfamiliar landscape. The fences were gone, the restrictions lifted. He was no longer a prize to be displayed. He was simply a horse, living on his own terms. But freedom came with its own challenges. The first few days were difficult. He had been raised in stables, cared for by humans, and provided with everything he needed. Now, he had to rely on instincts buried deep within him. He wandered through thick forests and open meadows, searching for food, water, and shelter. His body, once conditioned for structured races, now had to adapt to the unpredictability of the wild. The nights were cold. He missed the warmth of his stable, the soft bedding beneath him. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. He had never had to forage for food, never had to drink from an unknown river. Every shadow in the night felt like a predator waiting to strike. But Phantom adapted. He learned. He had to. One evening, as Phantom grazed near a quiet river, he noticed movement in the distance. A herd of wild mustangs stood atop a nearby hill, their coats gleaming under the fading sunlight. They were free, strong, untamed. For a moment, Phantom hesitated. He was different. He had been bred for speed, raised in captivity, shaped by human hands. Would they accept him? The lead stallion, a massive black mustang with scars of past battles, locked eyes with Phantom. The two studied each other in silence. Then, in a swift, decisive motion, the mustang tossed his head, a challenge. If Phantom wanted to stay, he had to prove himself. The two horses charged at each other, hooves kicking up dust. The mustang tested Phantom's strength, pushing, nipping, challenging his place in the herd. Phantom fought back, instincts taking over. It was not about dominance, it was about belonging. And after a fierce but brief struggle, the mustang relented. Phantom had earned his place among them. Phantom had won the right to stay, but he had much to learn. The herd moved as one, navigating valleys and hills with a precision he had never known. They drank from hidden streams, grazed in places untouched by fences, and responded to dangers with an unspoken understanding. Slowly, Phantom adapted. His body, once sleek from structured training, toughened under the hardships of survival. His hooves grew stronger, his senses sharper. He no longer flinched at the snap of a twig or the cry of a hawk overhead. He had become one of them. One day, as the herd galloped across an open field, Phantom felt something he hadn't in years: true joy. Not the artificial thrill of a race, not the pressure of competition. Just pure, unfiltered freedom. He was no longer a racehorse. He was wild. Months passed. The search for Phantom's Fury gradually faded. Without a trace of him, Richard Hale had no choice but to move on. The racing world turned its attention to new champions, new rising stars. But for those who had followed his story, Phantom's escape became something more than just a mystery. It became a legend. At Willowbrook Stables, Emily Carter often found herself staring at the horizon, wondering where he was. She had followed reports of Mustang sightings, hoping to catch a glimpse of a dark stallion with Phantom's unmistakable stride. Deep down, she knew he was out there, running free, just as he was meant to be. Then, one autumn afternoon, while driving through the open plains, Emily spotted a herd of Mustangs in the distance. She pulled over, her heart pounding. Through the dust and golden light, she saw him. Phantom stood at the crest of a hill, his mane flowing in the wind, his muscles rippling beneath his coat. He was no longer confined, no longer controlled. He was wild, unchained, and completely free. For a moment, he turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. It was brief, a silent acknowledgement, a thank you, a farewell. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he galloped away, disappearing into the vastness of the land he now called home. Emily smiled through her tears. She had done the right thing. Phantom's story became more than just an escape. It became a symbol of resilience, of choosing freedom over comfort, of breaking free from expectations. His name was whispered across racing circles, his story retold in news articles, documentaries, and discussions about ethics in the horse racing industry. Children were told bedtime stories of the great racehorse who refused to be tamed. Artists painted murals of his final leap over the fence, and in some circles, people claimed to have seen him, a ghost horse, untouchable, forever free. Richard Hale, though never one to admit defeat, couldn't ignore Phantom's legacy. His anger faded into something else, a grudging respect. Though he had lost his most valuable asset, he knew, deep down, that Phantom had become something no amount of money could buy, a legend. Emily's life changed after Phantom's escape. She left Willowbrook Stables, unable to work in an industry that had nearly broken the spirit of the greatest horse she had ever known. Instead, she started working at a horse rescue sanctuary, dedicating her life to saving mistreated and abandoned horses. Over time, Phantom's escape sparked change. His story led to increased awareness about the harsh realities of the racing industry. New regulations were introduced, ensuring better treatment for racehorses. More stables began offering retirement programs for former champions rather than auctioning them off or forcing them into breeding farms. Phantom's act of rebellion had forced the industry to look in the mirror. Though she never saw Phantom again after that fateful afternoon, she carried him with her in everything she did. His spirit lived on in every horse she helped, in every stable she stepped into. One evening, as she walked through the pastures of the sanctuary, she looked up at the distant hills. The wind rustled the trees, and for just a moment, she swore she saw a dark silhouette standing against the sunset. And then, just like that, it was gone. Was it Phantom? Maybe. Maybe some stories don't need endings. Maybe some legends live forever.